The nightmares started 3 days after visiting my cousin Jessica's house. My 5-year-old son, Danny, would wake up screaming about monsters with guns and blood everywhere, thrashing in his bed like he was fighting invisible enemies. When I asked him where these scary dreams were coming from, his answer made my blood run cold. "From the game cousin Jess let me play, Mommy. The one where I had to shoot the bad guys and watch them fall down with red stuff coming out." I thought he was confused, maybe mixing up cartoons with reality the way young children sometimes do. But when I called Jessica to ask about it, her response was disturbingly casual. "Oh yeah, he played some VR games while you were in the bathroom." She laughed. "He loved it. Such a little gamer already. You should see how good he got at the shooting games." My heart stopped. Shooting games? My kindergartner had been playing violent video games with realistic virtual reality technology, and Jessica thought it was amusing. At 5 years old, Danny couldn't even watch PG movies without getting scared, but somehow my cousin thought it was appropriate to hand him weapons in a virtual world where violence was rewarded. I had no idea that 30 minutes of fun at cousin's house would traumatize my child for months to come. Jessica had always been the cool cousin in our family. 10 years younger than me at 24, she lived in a trendy apartment filled with the latest gaming equipment, VR headsets, and tech gadgets that made her the favorite among all the younger family members. She worked in video game testing, which everyone thought was the coolest job imaginable. "Jess knows all about games and technology," my mom would say admiringly. "She's so good with kids and understands what they like." Jessica had no children of her own, but she positioned herself as the expert on child entertainment whenever families gathered. She'd roll her eyes at parents who limited screen time or monitored content, making comments about helicopter parenting and how kids today were too sheltered. "Kids are way more resilient than you think," was her favorite phrase. "They can handle way more than previous generations. You're just limiting their potential by being overprotective." When Danny and I visited her apartment last month, I'd been impressed by her setup. Multiple gaming consoles, huge screens, and what looked like expensive VR equipment. Danny's eyes lit up at all the colorful displays and flashing lights. "Can I play, Mommy?" he'd asked excitedly. "Maybe something age-appropriate," I'd replied, looking to Jessica for guidance about kid-friendly options. Jessica had waved dismissively. "I've got tons of games. Don't worry. I know what kids can handle." I'd trusted her expertise. She was the gamer, the one who worked in the industry. Surely she knew better than I did about appropriate content for children. When I'd gone to the bathroom for a few minutes, I'd felt comfortable leaving Danny in her capable hands. That trust now felt like the worst parenting mistake I'd ever made. While I was gone for less than 10 minutes, Jessica had strapped a VR headset onto my 5-year-old and handed him virtual weapons to kill realistic-looking people in graphic detail. The cool cousin I'd trusted with my child had prioritized entertainment value over psychological safety. And Danny was paying the price with nightly terrors and behavioral changes I was only beginning to understand. The full scope of what happened at Jessica's house didn't become clear until Danny's kindergarten teacher called me in for an emergency meeting. Mrs. Patterson looked concerned as she pulled out a folder of Danny's recent drawings. "Danny's artwork has taken a very disturbing turn," she explained, spreading out papers covered in stick figures holding what were clearly guns, with red scribbles representing blood and violence. "He's also been acting out shooting scenarios during playtime and using violent language that's completely inappropriate for his age." I stared at the drawings in horror. My gentle, sensitive child had drawn detailed scenes of combat, complete with weapons and casualties. In one picture, a small figure that looked like Danny stood over fallen bodies, smiling. "Has Danny been exposed to violent media recently?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "The level of detail in these drawings suggests he's seen very graphic content, not just typical cartoon violence." That evening, I sat down with Danny for a serious conversation. What he told me made me physically ill. Cousin Jess put the special glasses on me, and I was in the game, Mommy. Danny's eyes lit up as he described the experience. I had a big gun, and when I pointed it at the bad guys, they would fall down and make red stuff come out. Cousin Jess said I was really good at it. How did it make you feel, sweetie? Danny's expression shifted. Scary, but also fun. The bad guys looked really real, like they were trying to hurt me. But Cousin Jess said it was okay to hurt them back because they were just pretend. I asked him to show me exactly what he'd done in the game. Danny stood up and began mimicking shooting motions, complete with sound effects he'd learned from the game. He demonstrated reloading weapons, aiming techniques, and celebration gestures he'd apparently been taught for successful kills. Cousin Jess laughed when I got scared at first, Danny continued. She said boys need to learn to be tough and that this would make me braver. She said not to tell you because you might not understand how fun it was. My hands shook as I realized the full extent of the damage. Jessica hadn't just exposed Danny to inappropriate content. She'd actively coached him through violent scenarios while teaching him to hide it from me. My 5-year-old had been given his first lessons in violence and secrecy by someone I'd trusted completely. The next day, I decided to confront Jessica directly. When I called her, she was initially dismissive of my concerns. "Danny's fine," she laughed. "He had a blast. You're being way too sensitive about this." But when I pressed for details about exactly which games Danny had played, Jessica's casual attitude revealed the horrifying scope of what had happened. I started him off with some zombie shooting games. Nothing too intense, just basic target practice with moving enemies. Then we did some military simulation stuff. He was actually pretty good at the tactical combat scenarios. I felt sick. "Jessica, he's 5 years old. Those games are rated M for mature, for adults only." "Oh, come on. Those ratings are just suggestions," Jessica scoffed. "Kids today are way more advanced than when we were little." Danny handled it perfectly fine. He was laughing and having fun the whole time. When I described Danny's nightmares and violent drawings, Jessica actually seemed annoyed that I was making such a big deal out of his reaction. "Look, maybe he's just more sensitive than most kids," she said with obvious irritation. "But that's not my fault. I was trying to toughen him up a little. Boys need to learn about conflict and competition." I decided to do my own research into the specific games Jessica had mentioned. What I discovered was far worse than I'd imagined. The zombie shooting games featured extremely realistic graphics of human-like creatures being killed in gruesome detail. The military simulation games included torture scenarios, civilian casualties, and psychological warfare tactics. These weren't cartoonish adventure games. They were brutal, adult-oriented experiences designed to simulate real combat and violence. Found online forums where adult gamers discussed how these particular VR games were so intense that even experienced players sometimes needed breaks to process the realistic violence. Some adults reported having nightmares after playing these games. The most damaging discovery came when I researched the psychological impact of VR violence on young children. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a child psychologist who specialized in media, exposure had published studies showing that VR violence affected children's brains differently than traditional screen violence. VR creates a first-person experience of committing violence, her research explained. Children's developing brains can't distinguish between virtual and real experiences the way adult brains can. When a 5-year-old kills someone in VR, their brain processes it as if they actually committed violence. I found case studies of children Danny's age who'd been exposed to violent VR content. The documented effects included persistent nightmares, increased aggression, desensitization to violence, and something called moral injury, psychological damage from being forced to commit acts that violated their natural empathy. Jessica hadn't just shown Danny inappropriate content. She'd literally rewired his developing brain to process violence as entertainment. The damage she'd caused in 30 minutes of fun could take months or years of therapy to undo. My cousin's ignorance and dismissiveness had potentially altered my child's psychological development permanently. Danny's behavior deteriorated rapidly over the following weeks. The nightmares became more frequent and intense, often lasting for hours as he thrashed and screamed about having to fight the monsters. But worse than the nightmares was his daytime behavior. My gentle, empathetic child began showing alarming signs of aggression and desensitization. He started playing violent games at school, pretending to shoot classmates and celebrating when he killed them. When other children got hurt on the playground, Danny showed no concern, sometimes even laughing at their pain. "It's just like the game," he explained matter-of-factly when I confronted him about his lack of empathy. "When people get hurt, it's funny. Cousin Jess said so." The school psychologist, Dr. Amanda Chen, was deeply concerned after meeting with Danny. "Danny is exhibiting signs of trauma-induced behavioral changes," she explained. "The VR exposure has disrupted his natural empathy development at a critical age. He's essentially been conditioned to find violence rewarding and entertaining." Dr. Chen recommended immediate intervention with a specialist in media-induced trauma. She also had to file a report with Child Protective Services, as exposing a 5-year-old to extremely violent content could constitute child endangerment. The crisis escalated when Danny had a complete meltdown at his friend's birthday party. When the other children were playing a simple game of tag, Danny began shooting them with finger guns, making realistic gun sounds he'd learned from the VR games. When the birthday boy started crying because Danny was scaring him, Danny became enraged. "You're supposed to fall down when I shoot you," Danny screamed, actually pushing the other child down. "That's how the game works. You have to die now." The other parents were horrified. Several immediately collected their children and left the party. The birthday boy's mother called me aside with obvious concern. "I don't know what Danny has been exposed to," she said carefully, "but he's frightening the other children. They're saying he talks about killing people and seems to enjoy it when others get hurt." That evening, I received calls from 3 different parents saying their children were afraid of Danny and didn't want him at future playdates. My 5-year-old was being socially isolated because his behavior had become disturbing to other children. When I confronted Jessica about the escalating damage her decision had caused, she became defensive and hostile. "You're blaming me for Danny being a sensitive kid?" she snapped. "Maybe if you hadn't sheltered him so much, he'd be better at handling normal childhood experiences." "Normal?" I was incredulous. "Violent VR games aren't normal for 5-year-olds. "They are in my world," Jessica shot back. "Maybe you need to accept that your perfect little angel isn't as innocent as you thought." I realized that Jessica saw nothing wrong with what she'd done and had no intention of taking responsibility for the psychological damage she'd caused my child. The situation reached a breaking point when Danny's pediatrician, Dr. Michael Torres, reviewed the psychological assessments and behavioral reports from school. His medical opinion was clear and damning. "Danny has been subjected to what we classify as psychological abuse through inappropriate media exposure," Dr. Torres explained. "The VR violence exposure has caused measurable changes in his stress response, empathy levels, and behavioral patterns. This constitutes child endangerment." Dr. Torres was legally obligated to report the incident to Child Protective Services. CPS caseworker Linda Rodriguez took the case seriously, especially after reviewing the expert testimony about VR violence's impact on developing brains. "Ms. Thompson, what your cousin did was allow a 5-year-old to experience realistic virtual violence that's specifically designed for adult minds," Rodriguez explained. "This isn't a gray area. It's clear child endangerment through exposure to harmful content." The legal implications became real when I consulted with family attorney James Mitchell about protecting Danny from future exposure. Attorney Mitchell reviewed the evidence and was appalled. Your cousin exposed your child to content that's legally restricted to adults, he explained. It's similar to showing pornography to a minor. There are actual laws about this. We can pursue both civil and criminal charges. The child psychologist specializing in media trauma, Dr. Sarah Williams, provided a comprehensive assessment that would be crucial for any legal proceedings. Her report documented the specific psychological harm Danny had suffered. Danny exhibits classic symptoms of moral injury and trauma-induced behavioral changes, Dr. Williams wrote. The VR exposure has disrupted his natural empathy development and created pathological associations between violence and entertainment. Recovery will require extensive therapy and may take years. When CPS interviewed Jessica, she remained dismissive and unrepentant. According to the caseworker's report, Jessica claimed she'd done nothing wrong and that I was overreacting to normal childhood play. The subject showed no understanding of child development principles and no remorse for the documented psychological harm caused, the CPS report stated. She continues to maintain that violent VR content is appropriate for preschool-age children, despite professional evidence to the contrary. The district attorney's office agreed to pursue charges of child endangerment and reckless endangerment of a minor. Jessica's cavalier attitude about harming a child had finally caught up with her professionally and legally. Jessica's world began crumbling when her employer learned about the charges against her. Ironically, the video game company that employed her had strict policies about responsible gaming and age-appropriate content. When they discovered that one of their employees had given violent adult games to a 5-year-old, the response was swift. We terminated Ms. Thompson immediately, her former supervisor told investigators. Our industry takes age ratings and child safety extremely seriously. Her actions violated everything we stand for as responsible content creators. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of Jessica's recklessness. During the trial, prosecutor David Chang presented evidence that Jessica had specifically chosen some of the most violent games available, dismissing safety warnings and age restrictions. The defendant didn't accidentally expose this child to inappropriate content, Chang argued. She deliberately selected extremely violent material, ignored all safety protocols, and then coached the child to hide it from his parents. Expert testimony from child psychologists devastated Jessica's defense. Dr. Williams explained to the jury how VR violence affects developing brains differently than traditional media. At age 5, children's brains cannot distinguish between virtual and real violence, Dr. Williams testified. When Danny killed characters in these games, his brain processed it as if he had actually committed violence. The psychological damage is equivalent to forcing a child to witness real murders. Jessica's defense attorney tried to argue that she was simply unfamiliar with child development, but the prosecution presented evidence that Jessica had ignored multiple warning labels and age restrictions. The games themselves displayed clear warnings. Not suitable for children. May cause psychological distress. Parental guidance required. The judge, Honor Patricia Evans, was particularly harsh during sentencing. Ms. Thompson, you took a 5-year-old child and deliberately exposed him to content designed to simulate realistic violence. Judge Evans stated, you ignored every safety measure put in place to protect children, and when confronted with the harm you caused, you showed no remorse. Jessica received 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service working with child safety organizations, and was ordered to pay for Danny's therapy costs, which experts estimated could total $15,000 over several years. Most satisfying was the court's order requiring Jessica to complete mandatory courses in child development and psychology before being allowed unsupervised contact with any children under 16. The gaming community also turned against Jessica. Her social media accounts, which had showcased her expertise, were flooded with criticism from other gamers who understood the severity of what she'd done to a child. Jessica's reputation in the gaming industry was permanently destroyed, and she struggled to find employment in her chosen field. 18 months later, Danny is making remarkable progress in therapy. Dr. Williams reports that his empathy levels are returning to normal ranges, and the violent behavioral outbursts have virtually stopped. The nightmares still occur occasionally, but they're less frequent and intense. Danny's brain is remarkably resilient, Dr. Williams explains. With consistent therapy and a supportive home environment, he's been able to process and overcome most of the trauma from the VR exposure. We've had to rebuild Danny's social relationships slowly. Some parents remain hesitant about playdates, but others have been understanding once they learned about the circumstances. Danny has learned to recognize and express his emotions in healthy ways, rather than through the violent responses he'd been conditioned to use. Our family has established strict new boundaries around technology and media exposure. No one outside of immediate family has permission to expose Danny to any media content without my explicit approval. We've also educated extended family members about age-appropriate entertainment and the serious consequences of violating our guidelines. I've connected with other parents who've dealt with inappropriate media exposure incidents. There's a growing awareness that virtual reality poses unique risks to developing minds that many adults don't yet understand. The hardest lesson has been learning that people we trust with our children may not understand child development, or may prioritize their own entertainment over child safety. Jessica and I no longer have a relationship. She continues to maintain that she did nothing wrong, which tells me everything I need to know about her priorities. Have you ever discovered that a family member exposed your child to inappropriate content? How do you balance trust with vigilance when it comes to extended family? Share your experiences in the comments. These conversations help us all protect our children better.